Netlify team. So excited to have you on today's webinar about digital complexity or digital transformation in the face of complexity. I'm joined by two experts from the field, and today we do have an interactive fireside chat planned. We'll of course be asking our experts more about how they think about content and managing complex digital assets and applications. This is of course an interactive program as well, so we'll ask folks to drop any questions in the Q&A. Of course, at the end, we'll go through some of the audience questions as well. So thanks again for joining, and we'll kick it off with some intros. Chris, Angus, can you give us some background on your respective roles and organizations?
Sure. I'm Chris Eccles. I'm the Director of Digital Communications for the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. I lead a small team of creative and technical professionals who are responsible primarily for building, maintaining, supporting the flagship website, utk.edu. We also support close to 300 campus websites, and I'm directly involved in digital communications initiatives and strategies for the entire university from my role here in the Office of Communications and Marketing. And UT Knoxville is the flagship campus of the University of Tennessee system. We're the land-grant university for the state of Tennessee. And although my work is primarily focused on the Knoxville campus, we also work with our other campuses in the University of Tennessee system, UT Martin, UT Chattanooga, Memphis Health Science Center, and UT Space Institute. So although most of our work is focused in Knoxville, we have kind of reach into the entire state of Tennessee from a communications and strategy standpoint.
Cool. I'm Angus. I'm one of the co-founders and the VP of product at GatherContent. It's funny because Chris and I have been chatting for a couple of years, so this feels like kind of just one of our calls that we have where we talk about content and complexity. And that's what I spend a considerable amount of my time doing at GatherContent, is just speaking to different organizations around the world about how they approach content, specifically content workflow and content operations. So really excited to be here today and talk about that in the context of UTK. For anyone that's not familiar, GatherContent itself is a content operations and workflow platform. Very much like Netlify, I guess, has kind of completely changed the way that we approach building infrastructure for the web and development workflows. I would say that GatherContent is very much focused on that same problem, but just further kind of upstream in terms of where the content actually comes from, which tends to be a bit more of like a political process problem. So that's what we focused on over the years. We've been around for about 10 years. And so yeah, exciting to talk about that as well.
Awesome. Cool. So thanks for the intro, folks. And you bring up a good point, Angus, which is, how do we think about content? And, as I work with customers and they're thinking about Jamstack migrations, that comes up very much in the beginning. So maybe you can help us set the stage from the UTK side. Where does content at UTK live, and how is your content distributed across the various websites that your team runs for us?
Yeah, I mean, this is the big question, I guess. So in a university setting, you have communication structures that are centralized. So like Office of Communications and Marketing for us is the central communications unit for the university, but every college, major division, lots of the units all have their own communications staff, their own communications priorities. And so content is decentralized. And one of the big challenges that we struggle with and that we've tried to improve significantly upon in the last few years with the help of GatherContent and sort of the path that we're on with unifying our architecture for the web is, how do we make sure that the centralized content that lives within utk.edu or within kind of our central communications channels, whether that's social, email, or web, how do we make sure that information is consistent across all of these many campus and university outlets? How do we make sure that we create consistency, continuity, while also still leaving room for individual units to have their own communications priorities, their own messaging, their own strategies, so that we stay a unified institution from a communication standpoint, but that we're able to deliver disparate messages and decentralized messages effectively. So particularly with the web, because our unit hosts so many and supports so many of the campus units, we don't support them all. We have an IT department that also hosts and supports a number of websites. What we're able to do is we're able to sort of review, be able to provide some editorial consultation, as well as technical support in the building and the maintaining of sites. So that gives us the opportunity to help create a little bit of consistency, a little bit of, from brand guidelines, brand standards to, communications and messaging best practices, things like that. But we also have the opportunity to interact with all of those individuals who are responsible for those communications and make sure we have good relationships and healthy relationships there. So it's as much a technical question of where content lives as it is about relationships and how we communicate outside of the tools to keep people connected and on the same page. And we'll probably talk in a little bit about the challenges around the pandemic and when that first began and how we tackled some of those communications and content challenges here at UTK. But really one of the great improvements, one of the real steps forward we made during that time was by utilizing GatherContent to help us centralize the content and then also have clear communication channels around that content, which was something that was really critical in a time where the messaging was super sensitive. The messaging had to be right, had to be vetted and approved, and then had to be disseminated in a timely way. So, as many, I think, higher ed organizations do, we have a centralized set of priorities and messages. We have lots of decentralized communicators, and the work that we've been doing over the past 18 months or so has really been in trying to connect those things better and more efficiently.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think like it's just the scale. I think people maybe don't realize that don't work in higher ed. Like the scale of higher ed content is just insane. Like the amount of department and individual contributors that required as part of their job to provide content for the web is just so vast and so distributed. And then often the infrastructure that supports that is also so distributed. So like, I'm sure Chris will talk about this in a second, but the sheer volume of often like individual CMSs, for example, I think the average North American university has like 750 CMS instances. So that's kind of, I think it's really true that from anyone working in a complex environment, regardless of the industry, just the way that the problems higher ed has to deal with, higher education, is just so vast. It must be one of the biggest producers of content and also the biggest sort of owners of content in terms of like, they just own so much content that needs to be maintained, needs to be kept up to date, and can be extremely sort of brand damaging if it isn't up to date. And then resources are really hard as well. Like I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit in a second. Just those different teams that Chris, I'm sure you're working with, having to sort of level up those teams, teach them how to build and deploy websites, but then also how to produce content that's on brand consistently. Is I think like the biggest challenge in terms of just content workflow and where does content come from.
Yeah, and Chris, I would actually love if you could tell us maybe more about those teams, those individual teams within the university that are creating the content, right? What does their workflow look like? What do they care about? How have you helped them with some of the changes you've been making?
Yeah, and to Angus's point, those teams are disparate, and the communicators themselves range in terms of their roles and their positions. So, in many cases, units have dedicated professional communicators. So they have people that are specifically, trained. This is the work that they do, and they build websites, they send broadcast emails, they write press releases, things like that. But in a lot of cases, we have communicators who are responsible for, the same level of communication in their various units, but they may not be a professional communicator. So they may be, sometimes we have administrative assistants, or we have people that work in, roles like social media specifically, where it's not truly web content, but they're still responsible for maintaining their web presence, brand standards, identity, and all of those things. So part of the work that we do, and part of what we're really trying to continue to improve is how do we provide really effective and useful resources to give communicators of kind of the full strata of technical proficiency the ability to do their jobs really well and to speak on behalf of the university clearly and effectively and in a way that, Angus pointed out is not reputational or brand damaging. We have really, really great, really talented communicators all across this campus. And so it's kind of our effort is to make sure that whatever your skill level is or whatever your individual position is, we've helped provide tools and workflows to make those people effective. To give an example of that, we've been working over the last 12, 16 months or so, I don't know exactly how long it is, on a shared design system, which is built largely around WordPress as a CMS because we are so heavily invested in WordPress. But the design system is sort of three components. It's a framework that's built on Bootstrap, so that if you're not building within the CMS, if you're building HTML, PHP pages, you've got a Bootstrap framework to build on. And so the brand guidelines, the colors, all of the cosmetic layering is consistent there. It's also got a WordPress plugin that we built, a custom plugin that is a set of custom Gutenberg blocks for the Gutenberg editor, so that you can build sort of pre-compiled components and then apply them to your websites. They're already styled. They're already, they've got options that are sort of set to conform to our style guides, and then a WordPress theme that is the third component of that shared design system that allows it all to sort of tie together and work together. And we've done this not in an effort to like constrain people to, you can only build your websites this way, like a really restrictive theme within the CMS environment. We've really built it so that you can stay effectively on brand, but have the flexibility to deploy your content through this component system in whatever way works best for you. So if you need to build landing pages, or you need to build interior pages, or you need to build a one-off microsite, we've given you like a set of tools that can be used creatively. You can expand on them, you can adjust and edit them, and kind of manipulate them in a way that gives you flexibility. But they're at their base level, they're already consistent, so that the more we deploy this and the further this project kind of rolls out, I think the greater consistency in communications we'll see. And then the other side of that project is to help create more consistency in the actual content, not just in the presentation, but in the actual content.
Super nice. I think that's the thing that's different about the way that you're working, is that like that idea of like the design system isn't meant to impose rules. It's sort of more about enablement. And like I think there's two different approaches to design systems. A lot of people sort of almost like abuse a design system, and not abuse it, but like use it as like a sort of whip to keep people in control. And it's got like, can have quite a negative sort of reputation in a larger organization. Whereas I think the way that you're using it is really nice, because it enables you, having less resources in some of these teams, to have the confidence that people are building stuff consistently, but then it also just sets them up for success and makes it easier for them to work. So it's like, it seems like you worked quite closely with them as well on those design systems. Like it wasn't like you just unleashed a design system, then enforced it in all these teams. You seems to kind of work quite closely with them on that, didn't you?
Yeah, and we've seen some really good examples of this type of collaborative work at other universities, peer institutions. And we really wanted to make sure that we took a community approach to it, for sure. And it's something we've learned, not just about building product for web, but also in all of these communications and content management operations. It benefits from community in a way that old tyrannical, like you must conform to this look and feel and fit in this box model just didn't enable. We've gotten not only more buy-in from the community to participate in this and to leverage it, but also we've gained a tremendous amount of improved functionality, features, lots of additional eyes on the product and on the process has helped us make it better. And it's not complete. I don't want to get the impression that this is a fully formed, fully realized process. We're still very midstream with it. But I think the participation of our campus web developers community, as well as our campus communicators in general, has helped us understand better what tools they need, what resources they need from a content organization, content management, and then presentation standpoint. And that's enabled us to build, I think, more effectively and more efficiently to the requirements of a pretty diverse, again, like I said earlier, pretty diverse, cohort of users for the products.
Yeah, Chris, you keep bringing up points which are really relevant to folks as they start, thinking about Jamstack and thinking about re-architecting web properties to really build in a kind of more modern way. That's typically something I see a lot is, okay, how can we, set up a shared component library? How can we set up our design system so that we're not reinventing the wheel? And then you bring up another important point too, which is, okay, how do we get the non-technical folks, building and empowered, and how do we get, other teams that might not have been involved in web, how do we get them to really feel like they have a place in this new stack, and this, especially, with Jamstack architecture, making them, feel comfortable working with the new stack. So it's super interesting stuff. And I think that, today's webinar is all about digital transformation in the face of complexity, right? So you had a great story that I did want to dive deeper on. So when you had to change content quickly, right? You were faced with this global pandemic. How did you as a university go about making those fast-paced changes? What were some of the results that you saw?
Yeah, and I don't want to give the impression at any point that I am solely or even largely responsible for the work that was done during the pandemic, or the successes that I think we had as a university in tackling a lot of these communication challenges. I was just one small part, and we had an enormous amount of really intelligent, really capable professionals at every single level of this university collaborating to deliver what was, in a way, maybe for the first time, like sort of life and death information. We really recognized that as the pandemic was beginning and we didn't understand everything about it yet, people's lives were on the line here. And we wanted to make sure that every communication was right and every communication reached the right audiences. So, excuse me, when we first recognized that this was going to be a significant issue for the campus, an emergency operations center was stood up here, that was led by some of our public safety and public health individuals, and we had everyone from the chancellor to even the system president engaged in this work. And this was where decisions were being made about sending students home from campus, for people that had to stay on campus and had to be housed in place. What were we doing for quarantine? What were we doing about food? What were we doing about, even things like tuition? Students had paid and they were being sent home, and all these questions that really had to be answered. And so we stood up a joint information center, I think a JIC is what we called it. And it was staffed with communications professionals from our office and from across the campus. And it was our job to really take every single day and identify the most important communications priorities, and then communicate those via email, via the web, via social media, and in other ways. And all this information had to be timely, it had to be coordinated, had to be clearly dispersed. And it was super difficult with the ways that we had been working before. We just didn't have fully formed collaborative ways to even just talk to each other about the messaging. So part of what we did was we created a physical space. We were all socially distanced, but we were in a physical space in our student union so we could talk to one another. But then we had to find some way to draft, to revise, to approve, to get approval at the highest level in every single communication. We started with some shared documents, we tried email. It was really the traditional methods that within one office can work fine. But when you're talking about the number of people that had to be engaged in just, looking at is this message accurate from a health standpoint? Is this message accurate from a legal standpoint? There were so many folks that needed to be involved, and we had to get it right. At that moment, we had really no choice but to find some type of central content management platform. And we had already been looking at GatherContent as we were kind of reviewing and evaluating platforms. And we made the decision to just jump in feet first. We didn't end up talking to a sales rep, or we didn't end up doing a lot of compare and contrasting here. We just said, we need something, this looks good, we're going to try it. And we did. And what happened was almost immediately, because the platform itself was so intuitive, people started understanding how to work together. We were able to build clear workflows. We were able to draft, revise, approve, publish the content from one place with the right stakeholders engaged at the right times. And as crazy as it sounds, like as a university, at least in a communication sense, we'd never really done that before, not in that way, not in such a, so many people involved. And it was like immediately transformational. We understood the power of sort of centralized and organized communication structures like this. So we ended up utilizing GatherContent to not only help us, draft, revise, approve, and send out email communications, but we then built our coronavirus website for the university, which was a hugely important piece of communications strategy for us. We spun up from the ground up a brand new microsite within UTK.edu that we had originally built quickly to get information up, and then we had sort of a running FAQ that we just kept adding things to. And we realized that that was just not an efficient way to get people this critical information. So we tore it down and rebuilt it again with GatherContent sort of as the back end. And instead of doing FAQs, we started building these guides, these content guides. So what do you need to know about how to self-isolate? What do you need to know about where quarantine is happening? What do you need to know about where to find food resources on campus? Where do you need to know about? So we built these guides, and this is where we got our content folks to actually write real, useful content pieces instead of just simple 2-paragraph FAQ answers. And it was an enormous effort to do all this, but GatherContent and that sort of centralized content model was essential in our ability to track where in the workflow every article was, every guide was, what had been published, what was still in need of review, revision. And that whole process for several months, and it continues today. We still manage that coronavirus site today in the same way. It utterly transformed the way that so many stakeholders engaged with critical information, and we've since applied that model in our Office of Communications and Marketing to many more types of communications than just the critical COVID communications.
Nice. Well, thank you for sharing such nice stuff about GatherContent. Are you sure no bribes were exchanged?
It's not a sales. It's just the truth. I mean, that's what enabled us to make such a dramatic transformation during a critical and complex communications moment. In this case, it was the tool.
It's amazing. Yeah, it's interesting as well. Just like generally that model, like you're saying, just a centralized content production model. Do you think that's kind of like, because in a way, for me, what happened during coronavirus for a lot of organizations was it just sort of concentrated the problem that already existed. Like there was already a lot of people producing content for certain content types, like an FAQ is such a perfect example, because you might have an FAQ page or a series of answers that need produced, and you might have questions that, for example, student recruitment are the only organization that can answer, and then another person that's like international students got another FAQ, and other parts of the organization that are responsible for different questions. And there's loads of other pages that you could say adhere to that same model, where there's ultimately loads of different departments that are involved in producing content for different components of them. And what coronavirus kind of proved is that it just doesn't scale, and you can't do it at a very good velocity if you're relying on like email and Word documents and old infrastructure to solve that problem. And I think what's really cool with the way that you guys are working is you've kind of taken that, kept doing it for one, and it seems like that's almost a thing that's put fuel on the fire for your whole organization to change your whole infrastructure in a way. So like fed into this sort of acceptance, not acceptance, but embracing like Jamstack architecture, for example, or thinking of the web quite differently, thinking of it just as a series of sort of workflows that feed into each other, right from the sense of like getting a piece of content approved that's an FAQ that's going to end up on a page, and who's involved in that, and what are the approval steps, down to where does that content need to end up, who's that content for, and what's the infrastructure that's going to support it. Because it seems it's super interesting feeding that into your design system, and how it seems most of the components for your design system are quite strategic in that sense and have been validated by your organization, and how that has kind of opened up you to go into like a headless model, or sort of working towards a headless model, and almost like the whole of your infrastructure has now become heavily decoupled, and people are aware of sort of which part they own. Would you say that's true? Is that a theme that it's sort of opened up you to have conversations around completely reformatting or reframing your infrastructure to be more decoupled?
Yes, and I apologize. There's some work going on outside my office, if you can hear that. Sorry about that. But the decoupled model from a content organization and delivery standpoint is absolutely accurate, and we're definitely moving that direction. But I think the interesting part is that on the content creation and then sort of communication part of it is we've like recoupled a lot of that. We've actually had to bring a lot of the stuff on the front end of the content management work together in a way that it wasn't before, because it has been so decentralized. And it's not that it's completely unified now by any means, but we've definitely begun putting tools and processes in place to keep the people responsible for those communications across the entire campus connected to each other, so that as we do utilize these tools and as we do kind of create these decoupled processes for sort of like deploying the web, all the stuff that happens before you go to the deployment part has been standardized more, centralized more, and it's far more cohesive and collaborative.
Totally. And that really is kind of where I wanted to take this next, right? Is, how does UTK create consistency across, the multiple digital channels that you mentioned, and the different content creators? How do you make sure that things are aligned and that folks are working in a consistent manner?
Well, that's really a question for my boss, to be truthful. It's challenging for sure. But this is where, again, I think it starts with the relationship. So if we left the folks that were responsible for communications across campus to work completely on their own, and there was really no engagement or connection from the central communications unit, we wouldn't have a whole lot of input or engagement about what they say or how they say or where they say it or when they say it. And with so many units on campus, there are still certainly areas where that happens, where it's not as efficient as it could be. But we've worked very hard, I think, and again, the leadership here in my office, my boss, Jacob Rudolph, who's the Associate Vice Chancellor for Communications, and our Vice Chancellor, Tisha, have worked really, really hard, I think, to create the human processes that will enable those types of communications improvements. But from a system standpoint, from a tooling standpoint, we've really been working hard on helping folks understand how their tools and platforms work, how their CMSs work, through training, through educational resources, and then just continuing from our standpoint to build out more tools and more resources that it may not make everything better this year, but next year and the year after, we're building something that exponentially, I think, will make all of these processes much, much better. And that's why we've looked so deliberately at Jamstack and at the way that this decoupled model will work in the future, because even though we're not 100% there today, we know that that's where we need to be in order for these content operations to truly be successful in ways that they aren't today for the university. So we're investing a lot of our time and our resources in understanding, researching, building towards that aim, even though in some ways, we've got a long way to go, quite truthfully.
So what's quite nice about it, though, it's more it seems, sorry, just move for a second. It seems more realistic, though, in the sense that you've not tried to do it all in once in like a 6-month project. We're going to do digital transformation, and then digital transformation will be done. I quite like the fact that it seems like a very sort of mature way to approach it, because I see loads of these projects where it's like, right, we're doing digital transformation now, and we've got a temporary digital transformation team, and then it's going to be complete. We'll set up some stuff, we'll buy some new products and re-platform some things, and then we'll have done digital transformation. Whereas it seems really nice the way that you've like pulled off some of your content operations workflows for some of your core content types and changed the way that your organization works, and almost like more of like a people side of things there, a cultural change. And then like the design system, that's a huge technical, massive success story, I think, in the sense that you've managed to go across your whole organization and get buy-in for a design system that will be applicable, even if it's not applied everywhere now, it will be applicable by all of these teams. And then slowly pulling stuff out of WordPress so that longer term you can incrementally, which I guess is a big philosophy of the Jamstack as well, and the big value of it is just incremental digital transformation, is not having to rip and replace your entire stack all at once, and you can actually just sort of prioritize and do it in a more agile way. So I think that's what's so nice. It seems like the biggest pitfall people fall into with digital transformation is thinking that it can be completed in like 6 months.
Well, I'll say one of the great benefits of having worked in higher ed for many years is that everything takes time, right? I mean, everything takes time, and often in a university environment, it takes longer than maybe you want. But patience, persistence, consistency all lead to the improvements that you hope you can make. And we've tried to be really thoughtful and really deliberate about the idea that what we want to build here is really meant to be incremental and iterative indefinitely. We don't want to work with you do a redesign of something and then it sits stagnant for 2, 3, 4 years, and then you come back to it when it's so out of date and so outmoded that it has to be destroyed and rebuilt, or else it just can't function anymore. And that's a shift for us in many ways, but I think we've really come to embrace that idea of iterative development in all respects, and understanding like our work is never complete. There's never a window where we do digital transformation or we do a new university website. It's always going to be a process of thinking forward as far as you can, building towards that, and then just keep moving the goalposts continually in as responsible and as practical a way as you can.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I think, some of the things that you bring up as far as the planning in the beginning, who needs to be involved, and how do we make sure that those technical needs are met, that's very common in Jamstack migrations that we see here at Netlify. The other thing that we see is, you're right, like it's an iterative process. Maybe one portion of a larger web property can be built in a new way with Jamstack. Well, maybe the other properties are getting migrated over. So that's very common, and I'd say even something that we want to keep promoting and keep helping our customers with. The other thing is future proofing web projects. That's super important too. Like having the ability, working with platforms like that are in this Jamstack world, GatherContent, Netlify, any other kind of Jamstack ecosystem company, is that the idea of being technology agnostic, the idea of being able to use the microservices or framework that you'd want for different web properties is really key. So Chris, kind of from your perspective, what content areas, what channels are you still working on? I know you mentioned you're not totally done yet. So what happens next, and maybe why are some of the web properties or digital assets more challenging than others?
That's a great question. And I apologize, there's still some drilling going on out here. So if you hear the noise in the background again, that's what it is. Obviously we are a large university. We have a lot of initiatives and a lot of communications priorities. And so I think there'll always be things that we have room to improve on, and areas to kind of get better. But really what we're trying to do now is build this sort of technical infrastructure to do these things right. And this is where Netlify has come in, and where we've had some conversations with you all about what is it going to take for us to move into a Jamstack architecture. And that's a lot of education on our part, because our teams have not built that way in the past. There's a lot of platform and technology expertise that we don't have in-house at the moment. And we've got to ramp up in some of those areas, and we've got to also rely on partners to help us get from here to there. And so that takes time too. And that's something that, in addition to just our team, my small team's understanding of these things, we've got to create some awareness around us with leadership and with the people that will be working in these environments in the future. So all of that definitely is definitely very, very meaningful and deliberate and ongoing work, which is kind of beyond just the technical and in the aspirational. Really, it's helping people understand the aspirations of what we're trying to do here and the value of it. In a more specific way, we do still have a lot of challenges around connecting our communicators via centralized content management tools. And that is sometimes questions of who all do we bring in to gather content? Who all do we bring into the tools where the content is centralized? Do some of those units need their own centralized content management so that they can do that in their spaces? And then we find ways to connect just on the key messaging and the high level, the high level things that need to be coordinated. One of the things we're doing right now with the flagship site is, as we've re-architected, is essentially we're looking to a lot of our campus partners and saying, content that you have on your website now probably belongs within the main site in a more purposeful way. How do we get that from where it is to where it needs to be? And how do we keep those relationships healthy and right, so that we understand who's going to be managing that content? Because those are the subject matter experts. My team in our Office of Communications and Marketing are not the subject matter experts on student recruitment or financial aid or housing. We're not the experts there. So how do we get that content migrated into the central flagship site in the right way, while maintaining those areas of expertise and in the content? because I don't want my team necessarily to be the ones updating and editing that content that someone else is truly the owner of. So those challenges are things that we're definitely trying to solve for and definitely trying to improve. But that's where the tools that we've been discussing today and some others, are really helping us to enable those things to happen.
Do you think you talk quite a lot about like the cost of ownership of content? I think it's kind of interesting theme of like the concept of an owner of something, like because we've seen a lot more in kind of enterprise environments, people sort of defining product owners of areas of things. So like taking more of a product management approach to certain sites or even to internal platforms. It's an interesting move we've seen in like larger enterprises is people having like roles like a VP of content operations, for example, and that person is the owner of the content stack or of certain content tools, and they're responsible for connecting those together. And I think that's obviously something that requires quite a lot of investment, but it's an interesting shift in the way people are defining roles of responsibility. And I think one of the reasons for that is kind of something that's probably very relevant to higher education is just the amount of almost like content and infrastructure debt that exists, like the technical debt that exists that causes so many problems. Like, I think one of the best anecdotes I've seen is Edinburgh University. They audited all of their websites and they had, I think, 10,000 different CMSs they were using that were live online that you could find, and they represented the brand, like huge world leading brand. You could find websites that were online representing them, 10,000 of them. But the stat that was really shocking was that 5,000 of them had no clear owner. No one knew who was responsible for them, and they might not have been updated for like years. So that is an interesting anecdote to tell to like different people involved. Is quite terrifying, I suppose. But then it's also interesting how that's maybe led to where we're at now, where organizations in all sorts of industries are defining owners of content, I guess, like the cost of ownership if you're going to manage this FAQ page, for example, but then also this person is going to be the product owner of these 5 CMSs or GatherContent or Netlify or this part of the stack and things like that. Is that something, do you think, that's like more of a cultural change, like defining owner stuff?
Yes. Well, for us, I think it's a question of understanding what ownership and responsibility mean. Because in the decentralized model that we've had for so many years, there's definitely a sense of ownership over content, partly because everyone's had their own website, their own social channels, their own communications. People like, hey, this is my unit, this is my website, this is my content, I own it. So there's a clear sense of ownership there. What I think we've had to work on defining is, if you are the owner of content, that doesn't necessarily mean that your website is the place where that content is best serving the audience. It may need to be incorporated somewhere else, or it may need to live in a different environment than the one that you own and control in order for it to be delivered effectively. So that's where what we've been dealing with and been working towards is helping to get the content owners, the people who have already been identified and feel that sense of ownership over product in their space, to understand that just because your content belongs like within the main site, within the flagship site of utk.edu, does not mean you are any less the owner of it. It means that we have a shared responsibility for it, and that our platform and our channel is the place where our audiences are most likely to find that information and have the most effective and efficient interaction with it. So now we have to create a bit of a shared ownership model. And that is where a lot of the sort of paradigm has shifted. And that's why the human element, the relationship element, is so critical, because without that, you don't have the trust and you don't have the ability to communicate around those things. And I have to give our entire leadership team in communications and our major units a lot of credit for that, because they've all worked tremendously well together to make those things happen. But then we have to create these tools, we have to create these platforms, these systems for that to actually happen. And that's what we're working on now. That's a big part of what the shared design system is about. It's what having a centralized content model is about, and it's what a Jamstack style decoupled deployment model is all about. So, again, if we had this same conversation a year from now, I think we'd be able to tell you a lot more about what has worked specifically. But where we're at right now, we're in the stage where it's beginning to work, and we can see the promise and the potential of it, and we know we're on the right track. We're just still very much kind of pushing through that from the human and the technical standpoint.
Awesome. Cool. So I think, Chris, you've really inspired the folks here today with your own digital transformation, and migration. We have a few audience Q&A questions that I did want to cover. And folks, conscious of time, but do want to, encourage you, if you have any other unanswered questions, please drop them in the chat and we can try and answer as many as we can. So first one here, I think you highlighted a few, but Chris, were there any challenges that you faced during the content architecture project?
For sure. There were and continue to be challenges in the content architecture process. Probably one of the most challenging initial hurdles to clear was roles and responsibilities. So when you talk about content, it's very often written content, but it's also photographic and imagery and video, and identifying who's responsible for writing what, who's responsible for editing what, who's responsible for approving what. These were things that in an ad hoc way or on a small system were well defined. But when we added multiple collaborators from multiple units, it was sort of like, well, this particular message is about housing. So even though somebody in communications and marketing is writing this message, they are not the authority on it. So who needs to approve this from housing to make sure that it's accurate? That's something we've never really done before in this model environment. So this is where adding the right roles, the right responsibilities to the workflows was a big challenge, especially in a time-sensitive moment. And oftentimes we had to sort of deputize a person to be in a role that might not have been their normal role. And another thing that we ran into it during the initial crisis, and we continue to deal with it now, is what happens when someone who is not typically your supervisor or not typically responsible for managing your work is now responsible for managing you in a process that you're a part of, which, although that's not necessarily a technical consideration, that's a big workflow consideration, because a lot of times we find ourselves where someone is creating content and the person approving it or the person reviewing it is not the person they work for. And that's challenging. It's really challenging, especially in a university environment where the lines of chains of command and the lines of hierarchy are pretty clearly drawn. And I think that's a big part of why the centralized content modeling has helped us, because we've been able to break out of the "you're my approver" model and reframe it into a "you're the approver" in this process. And that's okay. So all I need to know as a content creator is who is the approver, and I can see that articulated in our GatherContent workflow. And now I understand that it's okay. I don't have to worry about chain of command and hierarchy. This is the person that's assigned to that, and that's the way we'll handle it. So although that's not a specifically technical consideration, I think it's a really important one and a hurdle that we continue to kind of get over. From a more technical standpoint, probably the biggest challenge, and the one that will take us the most time to really address, is the technical integration parts. So when you do decide to put your content all in one place, that's great, but now you got to get it out of that one place to everywhere it needs to go. And so building some custom integrations has been part of our workflow. Doing some copy and pasting has been part of the workflow. But really, looking into the technologies, and this is where Jamstack comes into this so predominantly, that will automate and create process around those integrations so that it's not so manual, it's not so one-off per channel or per content type. And we've really been working hard to try and get those processes automated and integrated into our builds, integrated into our technical workflows as well.
Awesome. Cool. I can see that there are more questions here coming in. So happy to kind of move on to the next one from Steve B. Very low priority to answer, so Steve is warning us. But have you tried any technology besides Next.js, Gatsby, such as Svetlana.js? I don't know how to pronounce that one, but I can just say from the Netlify side, this is a strength really of the platform, is being able to bring your framework, bring your technologies, right, your static site generator, and then use those with the platform. So of course, we support millions of Next.js and Gatsby sites. We also work with, I've seen, Angular, Vue, all sorts of, in between React, of course, applications as well. So Steve, I'd encourage you to try it out. try out deploying your site to Netlify and see if that works. But curious if either of the speakers have any thoughts on that one.
Angus, do you want to talk a little bit? I know you guys have been playing with Next a little bit, and I don't know if you've tried it.
Yeah, similar. We've been sort of playing with loads of different ones with no sort of specific. I think it just depends on your context, which one works, which one's more suited. But yeah, I would completely agree. As Nelson was saying, just like it makes sense. I think the benefit is being able to bring what makes sense to your organization as every individual component of the stack. I would love to chat again in a year, Chris, and just hear, for me, like that is the most exciting part in a way. Once you've got everything connected and you have the development workflows really set up for having like a single source of truth for content, a single source of truth for your content model, a single source of truth from your technical component, and a single source of truth for your like design system, and them all sort of working in parity, combined with your sort of organization's attitude towards this stuff. I think that would be a fascinating chat in a year to see where you're at.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, to Steve, to your question specifically, we have tried a few other frameworks and a few other pieces in the stack, but our team is unfortunately very much in an exploratory phase right now. And because we don't have deep familiarity with this deployment model, this kind of decoupled architecture, we find ourselves experimenting and feeling really good about something and thinking, oh, this is definitely the way forward. And then when we layer in the next part of the stack, realizing that maybe it's not as good a fit as we thought, and we backtrack a bit and want to explore something else. So there are so many frameworks out there. I mean, just like it's hard to comprehend how many, components and integration tools there are right now. I think that's actually in many ways one of the real setbacks in this process now, is just not having always clear tools where you say, yeah, this is definitely the industry standard, or this is definitely the right, stack for us, and we'll just set that up and run with it. There's a lot of room for improvisation and for customization based on the organization's need, and we're still very much identifying and working towards, what's the best stack for our organization's needs.
I think that's a challenge I see as well, speaking to a lot of developers that come from like a background of specializing in a single CMS. So maybe you're like like a Sitecore developer, for example, and that's what you've done all your career. And then you've committed, your organization's committed, or you're committed to moving to Jamstack model. It's like, it's hard to know where to start sometimes. Thankfully, companies like Netlify have got like jamstack.org, and there's a lot of great resources online to help get started quickly. And it's something, that's what we've been doing as a company, is trying to create quick start guides so people can experiment and get proof of concept up and running and seeing what works for them. Because it is true, it's vast, it's very vast. With lots of different options.
Cool. Awesome. I do want to try and get to everyone's questions. So a question from Elaine Larkin: where there's no content expertise among owner teams, is it best to keep content writing within the content team?
It's a good question, Elaine. And again, my expertise is not in content creation, so I can't speak definitively on this. But I do think that what we've seen is that in areas where you have clear content expertise, it's best to let those folks drive the content development, particularly in university environment where we have some really specialized communications needs in really specialized areas. Research is a great example. Like when we had to close down for coronavirus, the research labs were a critical component of what we had to communicate around, because lab work doesn't happen remotely. It has to happen in person. And so the environmental concerns, the health concerns, the laboratory considerations, those are very technical things that we did not have expertise around. And so we had to let those folks drive the communications and then consolidate and centralize and send those messages out. But in your question about where owner teams may not have some expertise, what we do have is expertise and the ability to guide and to shape those communications. So again, during coronavirus, we tried to make sure that all campus units sort of put their communications on hold and let the central communications channels be the outlets primarily. And as we moved further into the pandemic, we were able to open up and kind of ease those restrictions to let specialized areas do their own communications, as long as there was still a clear understanding of what was being communicated where. So maybe to poorly answer the question, I think it is best to let subject matter experts and content experts take the lead when you don't have expertise, but it's sometimes very important to make sure that owner teams are shaping and guiding the nature of those communications when they do go.
Cool. So the next one actually kind of goes into organizational change management and how you worked with the internal team, Chris. So I think this is a pretty good one from Kirby. What tips do you have for organizational change management, especially when there has been strong resistance?
This is another one where I wish my boss could answer this, because his role in many ways has been, at a higher level in leadership, to advocate for the strategic changes and choices that we've felt are right, to build consensus and buy-in at a high level so that we can then filter that down throughout the organization. But absolutely, within a university environment, there are many strong and differing opinions. And communicators tend to be strong-willed, strong-minded, and very opinionated people, which is a great thing. It's a really good thing. But I think that the tip that if I'm channeling my boss, the tip that he would give is that it's really important to be transparent, to be clear, to build trust, and to make sure that organizational change isn't just a top-down or an institutional sort of mandate when you can. Make sure that those things are communicated back and forth, and that there's opportunity for those who have a differing opinion to have that opinion clearly heard, clearly acknowledged. And even if the course does not go the way that they want it to, even if you take a different path, help those folks understand that they have been heard, that their opinions have been acknowledged, and that when possible, there's a really good, clear reason for why you're going to go in a different direction. And I don't know if that applies to your situation, Kirby, but I think in our environment, that's been the most effective tool to help facilitate organizational change when you do have differing opinions.
Yeah, and I think you made a few important points about with technology decisions involving the teams that are actually part of driving content, right? Like making sure that they feel empowered by your technology choices. And that's always something I'll recommend as folks think about migrating to Jamstack, is like, don't forget about, the content teams that are maybe working in a CMS, and, make sure that also your developers understand and are comfortable with the new workflow. So you're right. It's kind of, you need to orchestrate, right, the different parts of the organization and make sure that everyone kind of has their home, their working space within the new stack. So cool.
I think an interesting mistake I think a lot of organizations make is that they frame organizational change in the sense of why it's good for the organization. So they'll say, we're going to do all this amazing digital transformation change, and it's going to mean as an organization we're going to grow loads. And then you as an individual or as a team are sort of quite fairly saying, oh, well, why do I care about that? What does that mean for me in my daily operations? And I think it happens in different teams. There's also a development team will communicate new infrastructure to a content team and say, well, it means we're going to be able to deploy faster and have better security. And quite fairly, the content team saying, well, like, why is that good for me? And vice versa, a content team saying, well, we've changed our infrastructure, we've got a single source of truth. Now we can approve content faster and it's more reusable. Quite fairly, the development team says, well, why is that good for me? I think it's like important for each individual team to explain why it's helpful for the other teams from their perspective versus just, this is going to be great for the organization as a whole or for me. And again, I think that's what you've done really well, Chris, in UTK.
Well, I haven't done that really well. We've done
you especially.
Cool. Okay, couple of last questions here before we wrap up for the day. So from Paul, Paul is asking, does quality content get lost in the search for the best technology?
Man, I love this question. Angus, you might want to take it first, but I love this question.
It's a great question. It's my favorite question so far, I think. I don't necessarily know how I would answer it, but I love it. I don't know. It's a compromise, isn't it? It's a constant compromise. Now, like me coming more from the content side and always sort of fighting for the importance of quality content, I would say like that is what what matters most, and there's always going to be a slight compromise, But so I'd say it can do would be my answer to that question. I think I've definitely seen it happen. But I would also say on the flip side of that, good technology can enable better quality content because it can enable people to spend time thinking about the content they're writing more strategically versus having to, for example, fire around Word documents or spend hours trying to work out how an old CMS works. If the technology doesn't get in the way and it just enables them to publish content seamlessly, then using things like, well-defined template can enable the person writing that content to do what they need to do and what they want to do and just focus on the words and getting content that's strategic, that's got a certain audience in mind. The technology can enable that content to go to that specific audience and resonate with them. So yeah, I'd say it shouldn't.
Yeah, that's a good answer, Angus. And the reason I got so excited about this is because this is like truthfully the intersection of almost everything that I deal with on a daily basis, right? Because we're a technology unit. We are responsible for, how these pieces of content get organized, get communicated, get delivered. That's all technology that enables the distribution of the content. But the technology is pointless. It's useless without quality content, right? I mean, if you don't have something to communicate that matters, that is, something that the audience needs or wants, that's something that your organization prioritizes and has to deliver, then it almost doesn't matter what technology you're using. So this is where on a daily basis, we're balancing that, that the scales between investing in making the technology better because we want the most effective, the most secure, the fastest, the most reliable ways to deploy the content. But we have to stay focused on the content first, truthfully, because without it and without good content, without good content strategy, without good marketing, audience understanding, and all those other things, then you could have the fastest website in the world. Like, you have ultra great lighthouse scores, you could be super secure, and if nobody cares to consume your content, then it's almost not worth it. It's not worth the effort in the technology. So that's where balancing those two things is so critical. And I do think that sometimes in the pursuit of the latest, the greatest, and the best, we put content on the back burner. But we have to make sure that we don't let that happen, because without great content, again, I think the best technology in the world is rendered sort of useless.
Such an amazing question, isn't it? It's a great one. Another totally different angle is, how do you define quality content and how do you know if it's quality or not? So quality content, I guess most people would be that it resonated with the audience or it met a certain goal. Without being able to measure that, you'll never know. So in a way, technology is an essential component for actually saying, this content was good, this content did meet X requirements and Y requirements, and it managed to get there. Because the totally other flip side, you could have the most amazing piece of content in the world, but if no one can find it or consume it, or if you can't measure the impact it had, then you'll never know. Super amazing question, Paul.
Cool. Yeah, thanks, Paul, for the nice open-ended question. We did just have one more, which is even more open-ended, which is, how far can digital transformation go in 5, 10 years, or even more? So a bit reflective for you, Chris. Where would you say we'll be so far ahead in the future?
Sure. The rate of technological expansion and the exponential curve in 5 to 10 years, I don't know. We might all just be communicating via chips in our brain. I have no idea, but I think the potential for what we can do in the next 5 to 10 years is tremendous, and we're only beginning to really see the beginnings of that. I think we've worked so long, and at least in web, in sort of this monolithic model, and we've really thought of our content as being like seen in place. Like, you build it, you set it, you leave it, and then when it's out of date, you go touch it again. And I think the things that we're seeing now with content operations in a tool like GatherContent, the Jamstack, and platforms like Netlify, is that you have to be thinking about both your technology and your content as iterative, as something that will evolve continuously, and you need to continually be building with that mindset, so that 5 to 10 years from now, it won't be this thing got totally outdated and we're starting over again. We've had exponential growth over the course of the last 5 years, and where we're at that point, will be tremendously, significantly further along than we have been maybe in the previous 5 years. At least that's my hope. That's sort of the future that I see, is that where we're at 5 years from today will be exponentially further than where we were 5 years ago.
Cool. Well, with that, I am conscious of everyone's time, and I want to thank you all for joining us today and joining a really interesting discussion. And I'll thank everyone for their questions as well. This discussion was, of course, recorded, so we'll share it on the respective channels. But yeah, thanks again also to our guests as well, Angus, Chris, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.